Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. In a new national poll released last week, voters signaled they are divided over the Biden administration's Title IX changes to expand gender identity protections ahead of the general election. Joining me to tell us more about this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, can you tell us about what this poll found?
Yeah, so essentially this is a poll that's called the Voters' Voice Poll, and it was conducted by Noble Predictive Insights for the Center Square, which is Chalkboard News' sister site, and they're both owned by the Franklin News Foundation. And it asked 2,500 likely voters about their thoughts on Title IX. And so just brief overview, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later about, a lot of maybe people don't understand what Title IX is. Essentially, it's a federal statute governing non-discrimination in the nation's educational institutions. So that's K through 12 and also institutions of higher education. And it governs sex discrimination. So basically, if you allege there's sex discrimination as a student in those kinds of institutions, then there's these guidelines that have to be followed because of, that institution receiving federal money, right? So it says here's the federal money, but here are the strings attached and you need to follow the law this way. And basically that we're going to keep things open and fair for both sexes. And so what the Biden administration did is they said, let's expand these protections to gender identity. So these sexual minority youth, transgender students, they might need those protections as well. So that's what the Biden administration is saying. And so this asked voters, well, what do you think about those changes, like that expansion? And as we've written about in Chalkboard, those have been challenged in the court. So that's just like a little bit of background on Title IX. And what they found was that 45% of likely voters said they disapproved of the Biden administration's equity-focused push to prohibit discrimination based on gender identity. And then 48% said that they approve of the changes. And so it's like very, in terms of these kinds of issues, there's a very tight margin there. 45% saying that they disapprove of it and 40% saying that they approve of the changes.
But there is sort of some complicating factors to this. David Byler, the chief of research at Noble Predictive Insights, went into this. What did he have to say?
Yeah, he basically said that, the more you drill down into these specific issues, specifically like on Title IX, which is a complicated sort of thing. Again, I like to explain it because, maybe people are not super aware of it unless you're an education reporter like I am, right? You might not be super aware, or maybe you're if you're not a superintendent or you're not a principal and you're kind of thinking about that in terms of risk and different kinds of compliance issues. If you're out of the loop a little bit, you might not have that sort of, I know how I feel about this thing. And so what David Byler said is essentially, quote, the longer you get, the more people you get who decide on the spot and the more fluidity you should expect. So Title IX is a specific issue that people just don't know about unless you're an absolute news junkie like myself. So that's what David Byler was saying is like, unless you kind of maybe had a run-in with this and maybe it affected your life, like maybe your son or a daughter is transgender and you've had to experience this, then maybe you're not super, in the know about like what's going on at the federal level with this federal rulemaking kind of thing. So you have to do some explaining. So that's part of the thing that they did with this poll is try to say like, we're going to balance the arguments from both sides. So essentially they kind of framed it as, they're expanding the rule to protect these LGBTQ plus people. But that also kind of has that other argument there of allowing these transgender women to use women's bathrooms and locker rooms. And so that's some of the cultural like flashpoints that we've seen in a lot of school board meetings, right? As parents saying like, I'm concerned that there won't be safe spaces for my daughters to play sports or like go to the bathroom. And so that there is like this controversy in a lot of different schools, nationwide about this issue. And so they tried to really balance that together and see what voters said. And we still had that 45% saying that they disapproved of the 40% saying that they do approve. That tracks with some of the, earlier polling that we saw from the summer. It was very similar. They did the same thing as well, where they were trying to ask like, hey, what do you think about this? For these reasons. And then again, but it also means like, this, and that there are these other cultural issues that maybe people don't like about some of these kinds of protections. And that's something that we've seen in several states as well, where these kinds of issues with sports, for example, in some smaller instances where it just comes down to like a soccer team saying like, hey, we're not going to play against another team that has a transgender student on it. And so this is one of those cultural things that is just going to keep coming up.
What are some of the more specific breakdowns when you get into parties?
Yeah, so it's really along those partisan lines there. So 69% of Republican voters said that they were opposed to the changes, with only 18% saying that they were in favor of expanding the rule and the Biden administration's rule change there. And then 65% of Democrats said that they favored expanding Title IX to include gender identity. The true independents, however, they said that they were more likely to disapprove of the changes, with 50% of likely voters who are true independents saying that they oppose the rule and 30% saying that they approve it. So that's, I think, very interesting, because these are these sorts of true independents there that are not going to necessarily vote Democrat or Republican, even though they're saying they're independents. So that, I think, is something. And Byler also said, kind of tracking along that, and what we saw from independents is that on these other issues, like cultural issues more broadly, where people have stronger feelings, that there was a conservative, like a lean towards some of those conservative positions, right? That people were saying stuff about transgender issues that they were asked about. So I think it's a very interesting sort of thing that we're seeing, is that on some of these education issues and these like cultural issues around education, we've seen some of that, public support for some of these conservative opinions.
Yeah. And Byler also kind of mentioned one of the interesting things, though, is that it's not necessarily an issue people vote on. It's one of many that they consider, but it's not necessarily a turning point for most people. Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.